have the distinct pleasure to introduce to our graduates from the Tennessee Higher Education, Innovation and Leadership Fellows Program and the University of Tennessee Executive Leadership Program, some colleagues of mine. Dr. Jim Votrubra is here. He is the President Emeritus of Northern Kentucky University. Also with us is Dr. Keith Miller, who is former president of Virginia State University, and also when I first met Keith, he was the president of Lockhaven University of Pennsylvania. John Welty is here. John is the president emeritus of California State Fresno. Also, I want to thank Chancellor Angle for being here, the Chancellor at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. Thanks, Steve. Appreciate you being part of our group. And Vice President Tiffany Carpenter, you've got how many people at your site?
I have 8 of the lead communicators from across the system. We were already having a retreat, so now we're having lunch watching you.
We've got a lot of material to cover, and I want to begin by thanking all of you for joining us today. Let me introduce to you Isaac Kamola. Isaac is an associate professor of political science at Trinity College in Connecticut. Isaac and I have been working on this program since October, and it seems like something new unfolded every week around the general topic, and I'm incredibly grateful for Dr. Kamola for being with us. We have a respondent, Danelle Whiteside. Danelle just finished a stint as the interim president for Austin Peay State University and is the vice president for legal affairs and organizational strategy at Austin Peay. And I just noticed that the former president from Austin Peay, Sal Ranella, has joined us. Sal, welcome. Glad that you're part of this as well. So with that in mind, Isaac is going to make sort of a general presentation, and then Danelle will provide a response to that and kind of a context for things that have been happening in Tennessee, and then we'll get to the really exciting part of this, your questions, your inquiries. And so with that, Professor Kamola, I'll turn the screen over to you.
So thanks everyone for being here, and thanks so much to Bob for organizing this event. I should also thank the three RAs that have worked with me on this project, Aaron Supple, Sam McCarthy, and Nancy Lopez, without whom I wouldn't have been able to do this work on targeted harassment of faculty. And also Jorg Tita at the AAUP, he's their director of research, has been incredibly helpful. And I'm looking forward to being in conversation with Daniel at the end of or after this presentation. So I think that it's important to remember that each year hundreds of faculty experience unwanted harassment after their statements that were made in the classroom, in their research, or on social media are posted and circulated online. Much of this harassment includes death threats, threats to family members, and tons and tons of hate mail. And now we have numerous documented stories kind of going back to 2016, 2017, and on to the present of examples of just unwanted harassment experienced by faculty, or that faculty members experience. For me, this issue is a very personal issue. On June 21st, 2017, I was in my office and I received a call and a text and an email declaring that everybody on campus had to leave campus immediately. I walked across campus to pick up my children from the childcare center that they were at, and I went home and I was like, "What is going on? There sounds like there's an emergency. I have no information about what's going on." I was texting my friends and emailing around, and somebody put together that it probably had to do with something that our colleague Johnny Williams had posted. That's when I first stumbled across Campus Reform, in which there was it's a news outlet that monitors campus issues, and they had written a story saying that Johnny Williams had called for the death of white people because there was threats of violence, credible threats of violence that the FBI determined were credible. The school felt that it was necessary to shut down, right? That year, or in the few months, the school lost $200,000 when alumni withdrew their donations, and 16 students declined their administrations. The trustees were incredibly upset. Many called for Johnny Williams to be fired. Tucker Carlson, who's an alumni of Trinity College, used his show to ask why anybody would send their students to Trinity. Johnny's home address was doxed. He had to flee the state for fear of his personal safety. And in all honesty, our administration did not handle it particularly well. They publicly condemned Johnny's statements, further giving credibility to the false claims that Johnny had called for the death of white people. They unilaterally put him on administrative leave. They invented a review procedure that was out of step with what was in the faculty manual. And while they eventually exonerated Johnny Williams, they did so well commenting on the content of his speech, making it sound like he had actually said something problematic. The damage to this event are long lasting and continue to shape how our administration and faculty interact. There's many grudges that still remain, and it's really unfortunate to just kind of see that this one story that was published now 4 years ago had such a negative effect on our institution, but also a lot of the people who were involved in this. In the years since that attack by Campus Reform, I've written a number of pieces about this and this experience. The piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education looks at kind of my experience of what it was like to experience that, and to also that feeling of going to Campus Reform. And my initial thought was, how could Johnny Williams have said something so stupid, right? And that kind of realization that I was trusting this anonymous, highly partisan, highly political website over my Black colleague. And there was something that was deeply disturbing to me, that I realized that I had thought that Johnny Williams could have said that. And I think that that is indicative of exactly the kinds of distrust that this organized targeted harassment creates. And I hope that at the end of this talk, that idea of trusting faculty and not trusting the partisan attackers of faculty is one of the important takeaways. I also published a piece in the AAUP's Journal of Academic Freedom, in which I lay out the argument that a lot of the organizations that manufacture targeted harassment of faculty are actually partisan, oftentimes Koch-funded political organizations that for very specific political reasons are targeting university professors. And then in January 2020, I started another project. I learned that a friend of mine was attacked by Campus Reform. She taught a class that she thought that her students would benefit from. Campus Reform did not think that. They wrote an article about her. She had to be brought to class by security. She got harassment. She was a contingent faculty and feared for her livelihood after that story that was written by Campus Reform. So being upset about these two instances of Johnny Williams and my friend from grad school, in January 2020, I started a project where I monitor Campus Reform. I have an RA who monitors Campus Reform, bless their hearts, and read that website every day. And when they identify a story in which the Campus Reform is identifying a faculty and accusing them of liberal bias, then I email that professor and basically say, here's who Campus Reform is. These stories may not have any negative consequences, but sometimes they do. And if they do, here's some steps that you can do in order to protect yourself, as well as here's a toolkit that you can send to your administrators to help them protect you. And Bob is going to send out links to those toolkits after this talk. We also collaborated because of the data that we collected and the list of faculty who've been targeted by campus reform. We collaborated with the AAUP's Director of Research to do a survey of all the faculty targeted by campus reform in 2020. In 2020, campus reform wrote 1,575 total stories. 247 of those accused faculty of liberal bias, and that was a total of 338 total individuals. We issued a survey to all of those 338 individuals. We received a 93% response rate. 78% of the stories written in campus reform were critical of faculty for their comments that they made in the public forums, such as on social media. This is really interesting because campus reform claims to be identifying liberal bias in the classroom and on campus. And so what they're basically saying is that how a professor tweets in their spare time is indicative of how they act in the classroom. And so oftentimes you'll see them take tweets and Facebook posts and make it into a story about how they have liberal bias without actually being about how they present themselves in the classroom. 65% of stories that were published in campus reform were picked up by other news outlets. I'll talk a little bit more about this later on in the presentation. And most importantly of all is that 40% of faculty who were written about in campus reform experienced threats of harm, right? Threats that they found to be harmful. And another 10% reported unwanted, hateful and harassing emails or other forms of contact, but did not classify these as threatening. So more than 50% of faculty who are written about in campus reform receive either threatening or unwanted and deeply disturbing emails. And being in contact with a lot of these faculty who experience this kind of hate directed at them is really startling and disturbing what the faculty have to endure in order as a result of this targeted harassment. We found that 42.5% of the stories that accused faculty of liberal bias had to do with race. And there was a number of other and so okay, so those are kind of the top line findings from of the survey. So what I want to do with this talk is I want to kind of raise some questions about how should institutions address targeted harassment of faculty. And I think in order to answer this question, you first have to be able to articulate a distinction between academic freedom and free speech, because I think that understanding what academic freedom is and how it works, and I know that the audience is probably very well versed in academic freedom and what that means, but I think that it's important to kind of clarify this distinction between academic freedom and free speech, because I think a lot of the targeted harassment of faculty is basically organized around this idea of certain speech is being attacked, and therefore these kinds of venues are important to make sure that everybody has access to free speech, right? So the campus reform narrative is that conservative voices are being persecuted against because of a liberal bias, and therefore in order to have free speech in the classroom and on campus, we need to check that kind of liberal bias, right? But I think that narrative needs to be broken down through an understanding of what academic freedom is. Right, and so I'll kind of explain academic freedom, and if we have time, I can talk about why it's important to make that distinction with free speech. Second of all, I want to talk about the long-term effects on faculty and institutions, and I'll use some additional survey data to explain that. And then I want to talk about two ways that you can defend your faculty who come under unwanted harassment, right? So what are ways that you can trust and support your faculty, and also how, as administrators and people in the communications department, how can you respond in a way that publicly defends academic freedom, right? So, okay, so what is academic freedom? So I think that is really helpful to kind of think about. American higher education is very unique because we don't have a federal education system, right? Most countries around the world have federal education systems. So the kind of rules governing faculty speech are oftentimes written into federal labor law, right? If you're a professor, you can say these kinds of things and not say things. These are your protections, and that's kind of built into a labor law, right? And all kinds of law, because universities are federal institutions, there's much clearer guidelines. However, in the United States, because we don't have a federal system, academic freedom works as a kind of normative check, right? And so it becomes a kind of a professional norm, and as a result is something that's very difficult to understand, and also something that it's hard to locate, and it's fragile, right? And so that norm, the professional norm of academic freedom, as many of you probably know, was developed by the American Association of University Professors, the AAUP. And I think to understand kind of the importance of academic freedom, I'll just give a little brief history of the AAUP. Right. So during the first part of the 20th century, there was widespread dismissal of faculty having to do with their political beliefs. So people who were pacifists during the First World War, communists, socialists, as well as eugenicists, right? And then there was this kind of watershed moment in 1900 when Stanford University professor Edward Ross, who was a eugenicist and commented on the kind of he made some really nasty comments about Chinese labor, and was critical of the railroads for importing Chinese laborers. Southern Pacific, however, was founded by Leland Stanford, and his wife Jane was on the board of Stanford University. And as a result of Edward Ross's criticism of the Southern Pacific Railroad, Edward Ross was fired from his position. So that idea that Edward Ross was making a political argument, he was making an argument that was seen as critical of his employer, and he was fired for the things that he was saying. So the AUP was founded in 1914 to protect faculty from being fired, and in doing so, it laid the guidelines to protect faculty speech from external intimidation, right? So the 1940 statement is their big declaration on laying out the definition of academic freedom and tenure. And it was negotiated between the AAUP and the American Association of Colleges and Universities, AAC&U. And it has since been endorsed by 250 professional organizations and educational associations, everything from the Academic Senate for California Community Colleges to the American Association of Cancer Education, the American Political Science Association, the World Historical Association, et cetera, et cetera. 250. If you're part of a professional organization that has to do with the higher education field, then they're probably signatories of the 1940 statement. And basically what the 1940 statement does is it lays out academic freedom in three particular places. The first place is in research. The faculty are entitled to the full freedom in research, right? And in the publication of the results, and basically making the claim that you cannot have an external actor like a state, a corporation, an individual, a political party, a union, or whoever, whatever that external person or organization is, determining the outcome of research results, because that leads to bad research. It leads to research that's in the private interest, but not in the public good, right? And then there's academic freedom in teaching, which is similar, that basically that in order to have a classroom that is robust, where discussion is robust, and there's no threat of retaliation based on addressing controversial issues in the classroom and having discussions and sharing opinions and battling out over arguments and having hard discussions over difficult ideas, that it's important to have academic freedom in the classroom. And I think it's really important that the 1940 statement, it pins down this idea of academic freedom on professionalism, right? So the idea is that it's not a state legislature, it's not the head of a corporation, it's not the head of the Democratic Party, whoever, it's not any of those people who have been to graduate school for 5, 6, 7, 8 years, who have written a dissertation, who've written peer-reviewed books and articles, and are therefore an expert on the topic, right? You want the expert, the professional on the particular topic that's being taught to be the one who's making those decisions about what is the issue to be researched and how should that be researched, and likewise, what should be talked about and taught in the classroom and how. So if you want to create a space, if you want higher education to be a space where the experts are doing the teaching without fear of external intimidation, then you need the protections of academic freedom. Likewise, the AAUP supports a third kind of academic freedom called extramural utterances. And extramural utterances are basically the things that you say as a citizen outside of the classroom or outside of your research, right? And this could be at a rally or a protest or in an op-ed piece or in a letter or with your friends in a bar in private or over social media, right? And the idea is, again, that professors conduct themselves with professionalism, that they distance their private expressions from public expression. So you can say things on Twitter, but as long as you're clear that you're not speaking for the college or university and you're speaking as a private citizen. The protection of extramural utterances means that professors can talk about things of public interest in their capacity as a private citizen and also not fear the kind of persecution. And this is an important part of the protection of academic freedom. The 1940 statement goes on to lay out a number of key findings. So it's this notion of professionalism that leads to this the creation of tenure. You go through a series, 7 years of evaluation and review, and then you're given a tenure, and that is a further protection of your academic freedom. It also says that faculty can only be terminated for cause, which means that they show gross violation of disciplinary and professional standards. So, for example, if I'm a historian and I deny the Holocaust, that is an example of me being in gross violation of disciplinary and professional standards, because you can't be a historian who has a commitment to historical evidence and et cetera and deny the Holocaust. Or if I was to make that odious argument, I would have to do so through the professional standards of the discipline and try to make the argument that way. The 1940 statement also says that any sanctions of faculty have to be adjudicated through a hearing that includes faculty, such as a faculty committee, and that faculty must be able to have access to due process and appeals. And also that anything that is said, say, over Twitter or on Facebook has to be weighed against the entirety of one's career, right? So if I say a dumb thing on Twitter, that doesn't throw out all the academic work that I've done for the past 2 decades or however long. So I think that it's important too for administrators to understand why academic freedom is so important, not only kind of in a professional standard, but also in what it means for faculty. I know that many people in this room are faculty, but I think that it's also important to remember that in the era of both increased economic precarity in higher education and organized attacks on faculty, that the threat of violations of academic freedom become existential threats, right? Many of us who became faculty have chosen to do so at incredible cost. Lots of time goes into the types of training. We are trained for very particular jobs that aren't as well paid in relationship to people who spend a similar or less amount of time, but we do so because we believe in the academic enterprise. However, if we lose access to the university, if we lose our jobs, right, then we can't do our research, we can't do our teaching, we can't do those things that we've spent our entire lives and lifetimes training to do, right? So that idea that we could say something that would upset somebody else and cause them for us to lose our job is a deep existential threat, and faculty live in this kind of a sense of real vulnerability. That when we're talking about targeted harassment of faculty, I think it's important to appreciate just that deep sense of existential vulnerability and the ways in which, the thought of losing, that once you're out of the academy, it's really hard to get back in. In our study, we also found 3 faculty that lost their jobs following a campus reform story. Okay, so this is the part that is the what can everyone here do in order to support our faculty and support the faculty in the Tennessee system. So in our survey, we found out that about 45% of people who had a campus reform story written about them said that they received support from their administration. Most of this support was verbal and informal, right? And a lot of it was like, don't worry about this, you'll be fine, right? And that in general, the sense was that that was nice, but there's oftentimes a desire for it to be much more organized, much more explicit and more formal in a way. And 12% of people that we talked to or that replied to the survey said that they received punitive action as a result of that incident. That could be everything from a stern conversation to, like I said, 3 faculty who lost their jobs as a result of campus reforms stories. So what can you do about it? And how can you support your faculty? This is I think the first rule is do not let the speed of the viral story determine your response, right? These stories, they work very cyclically. They come seemingly out of nowhere because campus reform writes a story. It then moves to Breitbart, and then it goes to a viral, some sort of messaging board. And then that's oftentimes, where a lot of the email and hate mail starts coming in at that point, right? And so these things are very cyclical. They move very quick, and it's important to kind of slow everything down and realize that the arc of the kind of viral outrage will dissipate, and oftentimes dissipates fairly quickly. But the response that administrators make, that oftentimes has much longer lasting effects. And therefore it's important to kind of make sure that one is thinking through their response in a kind of organized, clear way, and not just responding in a knee-jerk way to kind of immediate threats. So first of all, I would recommend that every institution develop clear policies and strategies for how to deal with targeted harassment. I think that it's important to provide guidelines for faculty and chairs. UMass Amherst has done a great job developing a portal that you can go to. And if you're a faculty, it brings you one set of lists of things to do. If you're the chair of a department that has a faculty that's been targeted for harassment, then it has a list of steps with all of the numbers, phone numbers, contacts, the kinds of ways that you should respond, all the resources that are available. It's a really impressive kind of set of lists and guidelines. And make sure that an institution has a clear infrastructure and institutional strategy, as well as a social media policy that clearly protects extramural utterances, right? I think if you have a faculty manual that says, or a social media policy that protects extramural utterances, because 78% of those stories are about extramural utterances, it makes it really easy to say, well, this is protected by the policy of our school. There's, and that's a great way to show support preemptively for your faculty. In terms of how to support your faculty privately, I think the rule of thumb here is to always trust your faculty, right? In the same way that I questioned, my immediate response was, how could Johnny Williams have written something so stupid? My response should have instead have been, Johnny Williams is a brilliant sociologist. I'll bet that this isn't the whole story here, right? There's something fishy that's going on, because I know that Johnny Williams would not say the kinds of things that he's being accused of saying. Or if he did say them, he probably has a good reason. He's a sociologist of race. I'm not a sociologist. I don't study race. And so I think that is really important. The rule of thumb is to always trust your faculty, right? And immediately reach out and make sure that your faculty feels safe and supported, and offer tangible support, not like, we're here to help you if you need it, but give a list of things. And here's where being prepared in advance can be really helpful, is to provide a list of tangible ways that you can support. And also clarify that their employment, tenure, and promotion are not in jeopardy. And I would highly recommend putting this in writing and without being asked. So even send a letter or an email saying, we know that this is happening. We support you 100%. Just so you know, this will not affect your tenure, promotion, et cetera. And that way, that can be a real sense of ease for a faculty member, and they don't have to ask administrators to do it. It's really important to follow campus procedures, right? And so if there's a faculty manual and the faculty manual has a procedure for adjudicating sanctions of faculty, make sure that you're going through those procedures and not making up your own procedure, right? Because then that looks arbitrary and it looks like you are not respecting the procedures, and it also gives you a lot of cover to say we went through the proper procedures and this is the outcome of that committee. And especially because those procedures, again, according to AAUP standards, should have rules of due process, and should be able to have lots of protections built in for the faculty member. And I think it's also important that when you're developing public statements or responses, do it in collaboration with the faculty member, right? A faculty member, there's one faculty member that I've been in talk with, for example, who worked with his administration to write a response that articulated what he was regretful for, but what of his statement he still supported and why, and laid out a real an articulation of why he still stood by those claims, even if he wished that he had and it was a statement that he had developed that in collaboration with the administration and the communications department that was, thoughtful, and it kind of recognized, like, okay, that was a little bit, harsher than it needed to be, but here's the point I was trying to make. But then when that went public, it was completely edited and something else came out that condemned him for his speech, right? And he's still bitter about that. And then as far as making a public responses, the rule of thumb is to always remember that how you respond to these can have long-lasting effects if mishandled. And it's really important to unconditionally and publicly defend your faculty's academic freedom and free speech. Not in private, say, hey, we got your back, but to say so publicly, right? Precisely because it's trustees, it's political appointees, it's alumni, it's students who are clamoring for retaliation against faculty, or can be clamoring for retaliation. And so to basically tell your faculty in private, don't worry, we support you, but in public, not saying that leads the faculty to question how sincere one is in their defense of academic freedom if they're not willing to do it publicly and in the face of opposition. A good response should also cite AAUP standards, and it should not debate the content of what the faculty member did or did not say. Remember that oftentimes targeted harassment comes from partisan organizations that have a desire to twist faculty words to make certain conclusions. And so if you say, well, the professor said this, but didn't actually say that, but it means this, then if you're explaining, you're losing, right? So just I do not debate the content, but instead say that you support your faculty members. I think it's important to contextualize who is doing the harassing and what their motivations are. And to also, if the faculty members are receiving threats, I think is really important to be able to say that and to say that this is unacceptable. So here are some examples of good and bad responses, right? On the left is the president of Texas A&M after Tommy Curry. Tommy Curry was a prominent Black philosophy professor who had won numerous awards for his public engagement, including his public radio show. And in one episode, he was talking about parts of American history in which Black Americans could not trust the police and therefore organized self-protection units in order to protect the Black community from white harassment, the KKK, et cetera, from violent mobs, right? And in there, he basically made some minor comment about violence may be necessary in these very extreme circumstances, right? That interview, that 5-year-old interview, was dug up by a partisan blogger who then removed it of all context and then pulled out the juicy quote and splashed it all over the internet, right? If you'll notice in this response that the president of the Texas of A&M, he is, I think it's a he, condemning Tommy Curry's speech and basically saying that he is in violation of the core values of the institution, and nowhere mentions the protection of academic freedom or free speech, right? A good response, in contrast, comes from the chancellor at the Syracuse University. Professor Dana Cloud was at a counter protest. There was a protest that was protesting Sharia law in 2017. There was a counter protest that was basically saying that that claim that the US is being overrun by Sharia law is Islamophobic. She was part of that counter protest, and she tweeted out that the counter protesters were outnumbering the protesters, and that people should come and join the counter protest and finish off the Islamophobic protesters. This got misinterpreted, saying that she was inciting violence. The thing that I love about this response is that it's a clear articulation of freedom of speech and academic freedom, and it acknowledges, it says, our faculty must be able to say and write things, including things that make some that provoke some or make others uncomfortable, up to the very limits of the law. I think that's a really powerful a statement. Here's my dream response. I haven't found anybody, no administrator has used it, but it's part of the materials that Bob will be sending around. And feel free to use it. You can plagiarize it all you want. If I see this come out from the Tennessee system, I will be incredibly happy. And it clearly articulates protections of academic freedom, and acknowledges that if our faculty members decide to express him/her themselves in a manner deemed harsh by others, we assume that they did so with good reason. I think that. So thanks so much. I'm looking forward to engaging in a conversation and a discussion, and I'll stop. Thank you.
Thanks, Isaac. I'm going to jump immediately to Danelle and let her get in her 2 cents as she's identified here. Take over, Danelle.
Thank you, and I'm happy to provide a response. Again, I'm Danelle Whiteside. I'm Vice President for Legal Affairs and Organizational Strategy, which means I have a legal background. I'm a lawyer, and before transitioning back to this role, I've spent 7 months as interim president, as Bob alluded to or mentioned earlier, at Austin Peay. And so I'm going to just mention a little bit about the protections that Tennessee sort of lays out in some of their statutes, and then talk about, from my administrator hat, how these things also play out. So I just want to, I put this here. I don't know if anyone watches The Handmaid's Tale, but that very first season is all about, sets up the stage. And so what is so tricky is that administrators really have to balance that marketplace of ideas and preserving that with the harm that sometimes speech does cause. And so I just wanted to bring that to the forefront of your minds as Isaac has laid out these things, that it's not easy to balance that. And there are, we've seen in the last several months that democracy and freedom of speech and things like that are tremendously fragile. And so if you are not diligent in upholding those things, then it could lead us down a path of to The Handmaid's Tale. Hopefully not, but just wanted to give that as an example. So when we're thinking about some specific things about campus free speech, there's a whole act in Tennessee, the Campus Free Speech Protection Act. And so I just parsed out some pieces that might be helpful for you when you're thinking about how can you protect faculty, and they're protected under the law. So the General Assembly said that public institutions of higher education are to embrace freedom of speech and expression for students and faculty. Institutions shall be committed to maintaining a campus as a marketplace of ideas. So all of those things are protected in statute. There also is additional language about faculty's views and how they're free to engage in research and discussion, but be cautious in expressing personal views in the classroom. It talks about not introducing controversial matters that really have no relationship to the topics that they are hired to teach. But it also says that faculty cannot face adverse employment action for classroom speech unless it's not germane to the subject matter. So I just put that out there because I wanted you to, again, know that there are legal consequences for not supporting your faculty at times or being punitive. And there's all kind of case law out there that supports faculty when they are discussing matters that are germane to their subject matter. So I just wanted to put that out there. And then just briefly talk about putting on my administrative hat, what institutions or as leaders you're grappling with when you kind of are forced to face these things, because you will. And so as I was looking through Isaac's presentations, what I saw the good response and the bad response. And I think that there's a mix between the two that kind of have to work together, because as these things are coming out, there are people, you're juggling all sorts of thoughts and views and opinions about the subject of that speech. And so you administrators will want to make sure that while they are saying, I support faculty, you should also be saying, but I support principles of diversity and inclusiveness, depending on what that speech is, to make sure that we are saying, we're supportive of speech, but we're also supportive of anyone who comes here to make sure they feel supported and included. Also, consider other ways that to demonstrate the values that you seek to uphold. So as you are having these events that come up, or targets that are coming to your faculty, or these things can come from a number of places, not just campus reform. Your students could be generating these types of uprisings. And so you want to make sure that you are building in opportunities for people to engage in free speech exercises like free speech forums. Always be reminding your campus of free speech policies and when and where it is appropriate to have robust discussions about different topics. Because we as administrators, our job is to make sure that we are training the next generation to be able to engage in healthy and thoughtful debate. And if we're not keeping that on the forefront of their minds, when things like this do bubble up, we've already lost ground. So we want to prepare them so when these things bubble up and we are able to make, or we are forced to respond to events like this, we've already made that ground. Sticking your neck out can be a lonely place. It's lonely for the faculty who are being targeted. And sometimes it's lonely for administrators who have to say, hey, I don't necessarily agree with maybe what was said, but they have the right to say what they have said. And so I just put that out there because it can be tough, but lean on your team, because you have PR and marketing folks that if they're queued up and ready to go, they've already been working on things like this because this is not a new topic. And you're able to then craft a response that, again, both addresses the content of the speech, protection of faculty, but also the environment and the values that you seek to continue to uphold on your campus. And let's see. Finally, just wanted to put this one point in here. I don't want to spend too much time on it because Isaac certainly pinpointed that targets may come from outside influences, but sometimes those things may come from political powers that be. And so just for instance, we had a Black Lives Matter course that a sociology professor came up with. And so we got a lot of pushback on that from our own political powers that be. And so for me, what I leaned on was calling them directly, answering questions that they may have had, sticking to the facts, but also leaning on university counsel because they are able to say what legally we can and cannot do, and also our government relations people as well. So those are just a couple of points that I wanted to bring out just from listening to Isaac's speech. He was very narrow sort of in his focus about targeting faculty, but I wanted to sort of broaden it because there are a number of ways that scuttlebutts around free speech can occur on your campus, and you just need to be ready for it. So that's it.
And with that, we go into the scrum, and that is with the time that we've got left, questions, answers, points of view. Dive in, folks.
Sal here. Let me jump in. First of all, Danielle, it's nice to see you.
You too.
One of the things that strikes me about the responsibility of the administration, particularly I think the president, is that presidents, I think, I should say, we have to stay way out ahead of all of this and define the role of our universities within the community as, you know, a marketplace of ideas, that they are going to hear things that they agree with and going to hear things that they don't agree with. And that's what this place is about. I know that's in a very, you know, that's probably university la la land, because you're always going to have something that somebody says that's going to upset some individual or segment. But I think we have a job to be out in front and talk about what the university is about, and to a certain extent try to inoculate from being surprised when something does happen or something is said or a speaker is booked. And I think we can do that. I mean, I know within Clarksville, the president of Austin Peay is a pretty prominent member of the community and has many, many forums. And you go in, you know, with a certain amount of respect in the community, and so people will listen. So that's a bit of a positive bully pulpit to help define your university. And I think many universities like Austin Peay are in relatively small communities where you're a rather large fish in a moderate sized pond, and so can have that effect. So I think it starts way beyond the actual conflagration. Our role does.
It's interesting because what has changed, the landscape has changed quite dramatically, right? There's always been controversies on campus around speech, right? That's as old as the enterprise itself, right? But what's different is those controversies used to be fairly contained to a community, right? And communities would negotiate and fight and struggle and organize and work, you know, and kind of have their disputes in their own institutions over what free speech in that institution meant, right? And now when you have these networks that are built out, and then you have social media and desire to among media outlets to show controversy, right? And that these stories kind of very quickly become national stories in ways that they might not have before, right? And so I think that that's something that is different. But I do think it is important for like the presidents and the leadership of institutions to set a very clear agenda that, you know, academic freedom, free speech means that people will be, you know, that have to face difficult stuff. But I do think Daniel raises a very important point too, is that a lot of times the notion of free speech and marketplace of ideas is being used to enable very like hateful, racist stuff to happen in the name of free speech. And universities and colleges have had to balance this idea of how can you be like legally required to be an inclusive space where everybody can feel at home, right? And at the same time balancing free speech. And I think that there's that tension has gotten a really quite a tough one to navigate, especially within the kind of broader political media, social media ecosystem in which these incidences can spiral out of control really quickly. But I think it's important, and I think that's in a way why the distinction between free speech and academic freedom is so helpful, right? Because on the one hand, that question of how can we make a college an inclusive, diverse, and equitable space where everybody can participate in the conversation, that requires certain norms of how that speech takes place, right? The kinds of evidence, the kinds of arguments that are accepted and valued, right? As opposed to anybody can say whatever they want, even if that's a hateful thing to say.
Great anticipation that this coming fall, a lot of these organizations will use the campuses as locations for basically generating conflict. Mm-hmm. And the way this works is really insidious because the strategy is to get us to fight among ourselves and then destroy the institution from within. And then they sit on the sidelines. And if that sounds familiar, that is basically a lot of the strategies around attempts to erode democracy within our country. And that is to create seeds of doubt, to create dissension, and then to get people to fight among themselves. And our institutions are uniquely required to deal with provocative, to deal with challenging thoughts, and then to work through in a disciplined way for people to achieve understanding and to grow and to learn. Because you can't do that if you're not challenged. And how we manage that and how we hold to the values really define who we are.
Can I jump in? There's one great question in the chat that I want to.
Oh, is there? I missed it.
My question is about strategies to utilize when communications are labeled as academic freedom, but are not related to the faculty's area of expertise. This is really interesting, right? So the way that the AAUP standards work is that in classroom or in research, then that academic freedom is based on expertise, right? And if you're making claims that are personal or are not relevant to the class, if you come in and rant about something that is not relevant, and that's realm for sanction, right? Likewise, the example that I gave, if you're a historian and in your classroom teach Holocaust denial, that is. But the protections of extramural utterances are basically to draw that line between where one has areas of expertise and that sanctions from one's private life, speech made in a private life, should not then bleed over and jeopardize academic a speech that's made in an academic context. So there's an example, for example. There's somebody who runs a professor of, I forget what, but not history, who runs a Holocaust denial blog, right, in his spare time. And that is considered an extramural utterance. And in the classroom, when he teaches engineering or whatever it is, he doesn't bring in Holocaust denial. So basically that is a speech, a private speech that then doesn't have bearing on the speech that takes place in the academic context, right? So extramural utterances is not necessarily designed to say, you are an expert in this field and therefore we're gonna let you say stuff in this field, right? It's more organized around the idea of what you say in private doesn't have an effect on whether your research that you're trained to do or your teaching that you're trained to do is good or bad, and your job depends upon those professional standards. So in that way, defending extramural utterances can be tricky, but I think that it's helpful to, that may be helpful.
Jim?
Well, we don't have much time, and this is a very important distinction. I think, my experience, it is more difficult to differentiate between my public voice and my academic voice than is inferred, I think, Isaac, from your comments. If it were that clean, it would be a lot easier. But I think I've had presidents say to me, I wasn't speaking as president, I was speaking as me.
Yeah.
And my response is, you don't have that luxury. Now, that would be, because of the size of the platform a president has, it's more difficult. But even a professor, it seems to me, it is a bit naive to assume that you can differentiate those two roles and not have consequences that bleed over in both ways. Now, the thing I want to say is, I think Isaac, you and Danelle, it is good to see you again, have really been helpful in emphasizing the importance of universities and university leaders and administrators getting ahead of this and thinking deeply before things blow up. But I also think it's terribly important for universities to help faculty members understand the complexities of trying to differentiate that academic, that voice that is protected by academic freedom and that voice of free speech, because the nerves are too raw, and it's going to bleed over. And at least a professor needs to understand the consequences of that bleeding before they make choices about what they're going to say and in what venue, it seems to me.
Yeah. I mean, I think too that it's also, there are a number of instances where the outrage, or where the tweet looks, or the social media post looks outrageous, right? And there's a reason behind it. Like the example that I use is in 2016, George Ciccarella-Mayer, who was then at Drexel, sent out this tweet that basically said, "All I want for Christmas is white genocide," right? I read that and I was like, oh my God, how could George have said that? Like, that is something that's absolutely appalling, right? That's completely unacceptable. But this was 2016. This was before Charlottesville. This was before a lot of, and basically he was doing work and researching, white supremacist organizations. And it looked like a tweet that was just beyond the pale. But in the fact, it was kind of like, and I think that like his examples, that he really does push the line on social media. But I think like there was one tweet that caused him a lot of trouble, that actually after that he left Drexel, that he actually wrote a Washington Post op-ed explaining the tweet that it was, that he had made, and kind of explaining like, when I said that this is the cause of the shooting in Las Vegas, this is what I mean by that, and he laid it out, right? So I think that in a way, if you trust the faculty, then if they can't explain it, right, then yeah, there might be problems. But if they can, then say, okay, like that's for me, I think that tweet about white genocide was something that I saw, and I was like, wow, I didn't know, like when George then defined it and explained it in public, he got a lot of pushback. He explained it, he defended himself, he doubled down. And then a few years later, I'm looking back at that, and I'm said, he was explaining a phenomenon that many of us missed. Faculty can cause a lot of trouble, I think. But I think like taking the time to understand why they're doing it and giving them the benefit of the doubt, I think is generally a good rule of thumb, at least from a faculty's perspective. I know.
Yeah, I mean, from an administrative perspective, the damage that you have to undo from that is sometimes a whole lot more than just, slap on the wrist. And so it's
Danielle, to that point, the two examples, one from Texas A&M and one from Syracuse, I think, I don't know this, but I think there may be a different set of forces that assert themselves on a public institution versus a private.
That's true.
I had an incident here during racial unrest in Cincinnati. A faculty member came out and said that the family of a young teenage boy who was shot by the police should stalk the shooter and take him out. And it was said in a very public forum. What can happen in a public university, and presidents can confront this, is you've got to hang on and keep control of that circumstance so that others don't take control of it.
Yeah.
I'm talking about publicans. I'm talking about governors taking control, legislative leadership taking control, mayors, and all the other folks who believe those are tax dollars and faculty. So I'm just saying it's real complex. And I do think that it's important in this day and age, particularly, that not only administrators, but faculty understand how these things can spin. Mm-hmm. So then they make an informed choice, not a naive choice, in both cases.
Hmm. Yeah, but I think too that it's also helpful for administrators to understand that administrators are in the position where their duty is the protection of the institution, right? That's your job, right? Faculty are committed to teaching their students, their discipline, and also some sort of broader kind of principles of what society, like what information a society needs to know in order to thrive, right? So in a way, like there's that, and those two things, like they are oftentimes lockstep together, right? That you need a strong, vibrant university in order to have these other things, but sometimes they're in conflict. And I think that kind of appreciating that like sometimes a faculty's true commitment to like making a certain kind of argument in public in an uncompromising way because he or she or they think that that's in the best interest of society, right? And to do so coming from a position of having studied that,
Sure.
You know, that may at times be at odds with the institutional kind of sense of self-preservation. You know, I mean, and oftentimes they're not at odds, but I think these are moments in which they can be. I mean, a lot of the social media claims that get, you know, picked up and turned into targeted harassment, I mean, a lot of that are, they read one way to one audience, but they're an important message that a faculty member is trying to communicate because they think it's in the best, that it's an important conversation to be having.
We need to clarify something, and it's come up in the chat session. If I am a faculty member and I am speaking, say, at a school board meeting about a topic that is not in my academic area, I can claim free speech, but I cannot claim academic freedom. Is that correct?
Yeah, you would claim free speech, I think, in that instance, right? But it's basically academic freedom is this idea of when you are making extramural utterances, right? And many of those are going to be made in public forums that would be protected by free speech, and that those statements should not then affect one's of free speech in teaching and research. But likewise, there'll be a number of things that you make in public, right? Like, for example, this Zoom session, right, would be an extramural utterance that is on an area of expertise. So if I've said something that could be interpreted as whatever, right? So the kind of where extramural utterances, free speech, and academic freedom intersect, I think, is a little bit blurry. And but yeah.
It is, but there is case law out there that helps to distinguish between a private citizen, if you're speaking as a private citizen, and as a person who represents, say, your institution.
Yeah.
We don't have time to go into that, but.
Yeah.
Well, no, we don't have time to go into anything more. But I am grateful for those of you that hung on, and this part of the conversation, I think, was enormously valuable. So with that, Professor Kamola, best wishes to you and the continued work that you're doing, and to all of my colleagues that joined, Sal, Jim, rest of you, thanks for joining. This is what we do in these leadership programs. We wrestle with tough issues that administrators are faced to deal with. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
And with that, Isaac, thank you very, very much. I appreciate the research that you're doing, and that it will continue on, and you'll be reading more. Isaac is about to come out with a book. This is not a shameless promotion of that. It's based upon the research, and you've noticed that he has been a resource for both the Chronicle of Higher Education, Inside Higher Education, and other sources as well. And I always appreciate the insights that Vice President Whiteside provides to us. Thank you, Danelle.